If you were to ask any well-versed Elden Ring player who the hardest boss in the entire game is, their response would probably be Malenia, Blade of Mykola. If they don't respond with Malenia, they're probably talking about the Elden Beast, but whatever. Malenia, ever since the first teaser trailers of the game, has been a staple in the sort of Elden Ring community hive mind, with hundreds of memes, pieces of fan art, and on the rare occasion, fan fictions being dedicated to the character. At first, Malenia seems like just a one-off boss, with not a whole lot going on. A lot of players will know that she was responsible for giving Radahn the Curse of the Scarlet Rot, which we see him with in-game, but don't realize just how deep Malenia's storyline actually goes. Today, my goal is to share that storyline with you all, one which, after rigorous research, I think just might be one of the more interesting demigod stories in the entire game. And FromSoft clearly thought so too, considering they made this whole cool cinematic about her. Without giving too much away, today's video is going to be about the complete history of Rot in the Lands Between, especially as it relates to Malenia and her brother Mykola. What is Rot? How does it work? Where did it come from? These are all questions that I hope to answer today, but as always, Elden Ring lore is pretty subjective, so you're free to disagree with any of the points I make, and you'll probably disagree with at least something. My goal is not to pass this video off as the one true solution to the lore, but rather to propose my thoughts on what could be going on based on evidence. I encourage you to take a look at the story for yourself if it interests you, and also to let me know what you think in the comments, if there's anything that I missed, or anything that you liked about my interpretation. With that, we're going to get right into talking about the history of Rot. I hope you enjoy, and of course, thank you for watching. The history of Rot in the Lands Between begins the same way as so many other stories which Elden Ring has to offer, with the meddling of an outer god. To begin our story, we must reference an item called the Remembrance of the Rot Goddess, which can only be earned through defeating the boss Malenia, Blade of Mykola, at the Hallig Tree in the far north. This remembrance, like any other, reveals intimate details about the life of the character who drops it. And it reads, Remembrance of Malenia, Goddess of Rot, hewn into the Erd Tree. The power of its namesake can be unlocked by the finger reader. Alternatively, it can be used to gain a great bounty of runes. Mykola and Malenia are both the children of a single god. As such, they are both Empyreans, but suffered afflictions from birth. One was cursed with eternal childhood, and the other harbored rot within. In short, Mykola and Malenia were twins, both born to Queen Marika the Eternal and Radagon of the Golden Order. While the exact nature of this union is unclear, I've touched on it previously in my Empyreans video, linked in the top right if you haven't seen it yet. But the important aspect of this detail is that Marika and Radagon are essentially the same being. It's a point of contention in the Elden Ring community whether or not Radagon and Marika were always one and the same, or if this happened later. But regardless, as a result of this, the newborn demigods had a very powerful connection to the Greater Will. Marika, as many will know, was chosen by the Greater Will itself to represent and act as vessel of the Elden Ring, and this becomes important soon enough. We know that Malenia's Rot, in particular, is 100% connected to an outer god. The blue dancer charm reads, a cloth doll depicting a dancer garbed in blue, an ancient heirloom of some sort, raises attack power with lower equipment load. The dancer in blue represents a fairy, who in legend bestowed a flowing sword upon a blind swordsman. Blade in hand, the swordsman sealed away an ancient god, a god that was Rot itself. The only thing that I wish to address about this talisman at this point in time is the fact that it proves the existence of a god that was Rot itself. As for everything else, well, you'll see. My current theory is that the god of Rot, in a bid to disrupt and undermine the vast hold of power which the Greater Will had on the Lands Between, exerted its influence to curse both Mykola and Malenia. Malenia's connection to the god is more obvious, but I believe that Mykola's affliction is also connected. Eternal childhood is essentially a stagnation of age, and we'll revisit this idea of stagnation shortly. While it doesn't seem that Mykola's curse really resulted in any particularly enduring hardships for him in the grand scheme of things, Malenia's Scarlet Rot had a much more noticeable and malignant effect. Scarlet Rot is a status effect in Elden Ring that closely relates to poison. Both cause damage to occur over time, and both poison incantations and the very limited rot-related incantations both share the same magic symbol. It's actually the one on the thumbnail of this video, in case you are wondering. As a result, I'm led to believe that perhaps the god of rot is also responsible for the concept of poison, but of course there's no way to be completely sure. In my personal opinion though, Scarlet Rot is basically just a type of poison status which originates from Malenia in some way, and I don't suspect Scarlet Rot existed before Malenia's birth at all. The two status effects work more or less identically, and even their status icons are meant to invoke one another in imagery. Due to the relentless and constant effect that Scarlet Rot had on the young girl, we know that Malenia, as she aged, began to rot herself. At first, this may have been very minor, but it eventually began to result in the withering of entire limbs. This would have been concerning enough in its own right, but it was probably around this time in history when Malenia became significantly invested in the ambitions of her brother Mykola, and desired to take up arms on his behalf, a pursuit which would have been greatly faltered by the persistence of the rot poisoning her body. Now, to be quite blunt, Mykola is an absurdly mysterious character, but that's not to say there's nothing known about him. Chiefly, Mykola must have been very highly intelligent, but also possessed a supernatural charisma about him. The bewitching branch speaks to the latter of these assertions, reading, "Tree branch blessed with an incantation of unalloyed gold. Craftable item. Pierce a foe using FP to turn them into a temporary ally." The Empyrean Mykola is loved by many people. Indeed, he has learned very well how to compel such affection. So clearly Mykola had some sort of ability to bewitch or infatuate people, but I would argue that Malenia had probably the most agency and reason behind her steadfast commitment. Obviously, the two were siblings and shared a deep bond since birth, perhaps the only two in the entire world who could understand and resonate with each other's situation. Above this, as I mentioned previously, Mykola was clearly quite smart, at least about the metaphysical goings-on of the Outer Gods, and it was not long before we are shown signs of a plan being developed, a plan to quell the curses passed down to himself and his sister from birth. Text from the item known as the Unalloyed Gold Needle, as well as Mykola's Needle, speak of the effects these items have in preventing the meddling of Outer Gods. It would seem that each of these items has been crafted with the intent of reversing something different. With the Unalloyed Gold Needle reading, it is thought capable of forestalling the incurable rotting sickness, while Mykola's Needle is apparently capable of subduing the flame of frenzy if inherited, allowing one to cheat fate and avoid becoming Lord of Frenzied Flame. As far as I know, Mykola was never affected by Frenzied Flame to begin with, so I'm throwing my arms up on this one. I really don't know why it's his needle that's capable of subduing this, but whatever. One thing that does become clear to me, and I think you'll probably agree on this, is that I believe the Unalloyed Gold Needle in particular was being developed by Mykola very early on for his sister, and I do consider this to be a further part of the reason why Malenia is seen in such devout service of her brother. Many people really believed in Mykola's abilities to change the world, and none more so than Malenia. However, as I mentioned, the body of the would-be goddess was declining rapidly during this era. Still only a young woman, eventually her condition necessitated the need for prostheses. However, there would be a glimmer of hope. The prosthesis wearer heirloom details what happens next. A talisman engraved with a scene from a heroic tale. Raises dexterity. Though born into the accursed rot, when the young girl encountered her mentor and his flowing blade, she gained wings of unparalleled strength. Indeed, this mysterious flowing swordsman is the very same character who I briefly mentioned earlier with respect to the Blue Dancer charm, a figure who would change Malenia's life forever, acting as a respected teacher, and under the tutelage of this mentor garbed in blue, Malenia would soon be molded into the form of a true warrior. To understand the importance the blind swordsman had on Malenia, we must look to a few items which the swordsman left behind. The flowing curved sword is the very same weapon first wielded by this man. It reads, "Legends speak of a master of the sword garbed in blue, and his curved blade that was patterned after flowing water. Strong attack unleashes a series of strikes akin to a dance, offering a glimpse into the legend. The skill is called Spinning Slash. Skill favored by dexterous warriors. Slash foes as your body spins. Additional input allows for a follow-up attack." Allusions to this fighting style characterized as being akin to a dance and connected to flowing water are reinforced in the descriptions of the blue cloth armor set, worn in times far gone by the legendary figure. The cowl and vest in particular read, "Cowl/vest of a nomadic warrior. The blue color of its fabric symbolizes brisk waters. as fluid and flowing as the sword in the hand of its wearer. Just as still waters turn foul, stagnation leads to decay. Warriors must remain ever drifting. One of the major aspects of the armor's description, at least to me, is that it may reinforce an idea which I posited earlier on in this video. The idea that Mykola and Malenia's respective conditions were inflicted by the same outer god. The final line of this set, in my opinion, hints thematically at this conclusion. Stagnation leads to decay. I earlier said that I believed Mykola's perpetual childhood could be thought of as a stagnation of the aging process, and clearly, Malenia's rot is quite literally a form of decay. I think that by connecting the two concepts of stagnation and decay within this brief line, it reinforces the idea that these two siblings have the same outer god to blame for their respective hardships. This is of course just speculation, but I thought I'd put it out there. Whether you think my connections hold any validity within the text in that regard is completely up to you. That being said, what I think we can be sure of is that the idea of a warrior remaining ever drifting is very, very distinctly recognizable in Malenia's combat style. Throughout the first part of her fight in the Hallig Tree, her movements are represented as flowing, elegant motions, and even the sword of the demigod is imbued with a unique skill, waterfowl dance, certainly indicative of the influence the flowing swordsman had on his apprentice. Perhaps the most significant advancement Malenia would make, though, is her wings. These were mentioned directly within the prosthesis wearer heirloom. When the young girl encountered her mentor and his flowing blade, she gained wings of unparalleled strength. In the second phase of Malenia's fight, one can witness these fabled wings on full display, composed of hundreds or even thousands of Eonian butterflies. Malenia's wings were perhaps the first and strongest application of her rotting curse being used in combat. It was at this point, when Malenia was taught to embrace rot rather than reject it, that she became a true force to be reckoned with on the battlefield, and was easily the most powerful among Mykola's ranks. Things seem to be looking up for Malenia during this time, and clearly this is too much positivity to exist in a game such as Elden Ring, so why don't we jump ahead to the Shattering. I probably don't need to tell you what the Shattering was, but the vastly oversimplified definition is that it was a war which concluded just prior to the events of the game. This conflict began with Marika smashing the Elden Ring itself into pieces after the death of Godwyn at the hands of the Black Knife assassins. And during this time, each of the demigods, many of whom possessed their own ambitions and ideals for running the lands between in Marika's absence, clamored to retrieve these shards, bolstering their powers further. Brothers and sisters turned upon one another, engaging in bloody combat in a bid to pry the great runes from the hands of their own family members. Indeed, the Shattering was a dark time. During the war, the forces of Mykola would have been growing steadily, as those caught up in the chaos sought both a new order and a strong force, who they believed would be able to compete in the war. The new faction took up residence far away from the ensuing chaos, in the northernmost region of the map, past the consecrated snowfield, at the base of what would become the Hallig Tree. Mykola's Hallig Tree is quite the sight to behold in-game, but at the time of the Shattering, it was likely little more than a sapling. The Hallig Tree was one of Mykola's experimental ideas, much like the unalloyed gold needle meant to aid him in asserting his own order, whatever that may have been. According to the Hallig Tree crest surcoat, the budding tree was watered with Mykola's own blood, since it was a sapling, and yet the Hallig Tree ultimately failed to grow into an Erd Tree, as was apparently the plan. At this point in time, though, it's important to note that the experiment had probably just begun, and those who believed in Mykola were hopeful that given time to defend and foster the growing tree, the greater will might be usurped, and the world could be brought to peace, in some form, once again. It was now when Malenia came to lead the Clean Rot Knights, a force of soldiers who fought under the demigod in spite of her contagious rot. The Clean Rot helm directly addresses the faction. Winged Helm of the Clean Rot Knights, celebrated for their undefeated campaign in the Shattering. The Clean Rot Knights vowed to fight alongside Malenia, despite the inevitable, if gradual, putrefaction of their flesh. Their acceptance of their fate made these battles fiercest of all. In time, many campaigns were launched from the Hallig Tree during the Shattering, all of which Malenia led and was undefeated. Her legend is seen in the description of her blade, one part of her wartime prostheses. Malenia's war prosthesis symbolized her victories. Some claim to have seen wings when the weapon was raised aloft. wings of fierce determination that have never known defeat. But by far the most important conflict Malenia would partake in would be the bloodiest bout of the entire Shattering, the Battle of Eonia. What spurred this fight in particular is unknown. It would take place between the forces of Radahn, god of war, known as the Redmanes, and Malenia and her company on behalf of Mykola. The battle would occur in the Hallig region, more specifically the modern-day Swamp of Eonia, hence the name of the battle. But at this time, Hallig as a whole would have looked a lot different. Judging by the construction of the various decrepit and derelict cottages in this area, I would estimate that Hallig used to look a lot like its neighbor to the west, Limgrave. Likely it consisted of a number of grassy fields and perhaps some forestation, but that's about it. There is a vast expanse of desert on the easternmost coast, however, and I don't estimate that this area has changed much at all since before the Shattering. So if you're trying to get a better picture of what Hallig would have looked like, it was essentially Limgrave 2, and then a little bit of desert right here. All of the rot which we've come to associate with this area, as you may have already guessed, was almost certainly due to Malenia's actions during this fight. During the Shattering, the lands between bore witness to quite a number of intense conflicts, but the battle at the Swamp of Eonia was undoubtedly the most eventful and bloody conflict of the entire war. The game actually gives us a ridiculous amount of detail into how this battle went, who was there, who was fighting who, when. It's actually pretty cool and crazy, so I'm planning to cover the Battle of Eonia in a separate video where I can go into excruciating detail about all of the different characters which were present, what went on, who fought who, and explore some of the more niche details, such as why Commander O'Neill ended up with Mykola's unalloyed gold needle, and stuff like that. For now though, as this is a video about the history of Rot, I'm just going to go over the largest event in the battle, and of course, the very obvious repercussions. Of course, the main event of the conflict was also its final stand, wherein Malenia struck her half-brother Radahn with her blade, before throwing herself on the implement's other end, to infuse her blood of rot within the war god. This marked an end to the Battle of Eonia, but we can see from Hallig's present state that the conflict affected a vast region aside from simply Eonia itself. It's heavily implied that all of the rot present in this location now was employed either as an offensive tactic or as collateral damage from Malenia's fight with Radahn. And so the demigod who was once the most powerful of them all is now consigned to the eastern desert, Malenia's Scarlet Rot consuming him completely and inducing a voracious hunger for flesh which cannot be sated. Of course, all of the aforementioned events would have been seen as quite favorable to the outer god who had originally cursed Malenia and Mykola, and it was probably at this time and in a response to this conflict that the flowing swordsman would once again return to our story. I read the following description at the beginning of the video, but allow me to go over it one more time. The Blue Dancer Charm reads, a cloth doll depicting a dancer garbed in blue, an ancient heirloom of some sort. Raises attack power with lower equipment load. The dancer in blue represents a fairy, who in legend bestowed a flowing sword upon a blind swordsman. Blade in hand, the swordsman sealed away an ancient god, a god that was Rot itself. Now, there are multiple ways that this could be interpreted, and there are multiple points in history where this could have occurred. I'm detailing it now simply because I don't really know where it fits into this timeline. We know that the outer god of Rot was sealed away at the Lake of Rot. As the Lake of Rot map fragment reads, map of the Lake of Rot and environs, a great lake of standing water downstream of the Ainsel River. It is said that the divine essence of an outer god is sealed away in this land. Now, the most obvious conclusion would be that the outer god of Rot was sealed away by the Flowing Swordsman sometime either before or very shortly after Malenia's birth. But ultimately, I suppose that everyone's interpretation hinges on what they think is going on metaphysically with Rot. Is it able to still spread to such a large degree even if its patron deity isn't able to continue having influence over it? Is it completely autonomous? Or does the god have to be involved somehow for Rot to be able to spread? The answer is I don't really know. And while there are plenty of signs that point to Rot as being independent from its patron god, I think that an event such as the Battle for Eonia couldn't have happened, at least not on such a large scale, had the god not been involved in some way. That's just my personal belief though, and I would imagine that quite a few people will disagree with this interpretation, and that's completely okay too. Either way, whether you believe that the God of Rot was sealed away long before any of these events occurred, or after these events occurred as I do, one thing is very clear. This outer god is one of the few who we actually know to have had a physical presence. This brings me to the final item which I'd like to examine today, the Scorpion Stinger Dagger. Dagger fashioned from a great scorpion's tail, glistening with Scarlet Rot, a ceremonial tool used by heretics, crafted from a relic of a sealed outer god. As it happens, not only is the area where we find the Scorpion Stinger located just behind the Lake of Rot in the Grand Cloister, but what's more, it's actively being prayed to by the Kindred of Rot, servants of Malenia, servants of Rot. Is it possible that the Flowing Swordsman managed to sever and hide away this portion of the God of Rot? Is the God of Rot's true form that of a scorpion of some sort? I don't entirely know. That's why I'd like to ask you guys to let me know what you think in the comments. I'm sure that some of the points I made during this video, especially about the time in history when I believe that the outer God of Rot was sealed away, are going to be contentious, and that's completely okay. As I said earlier, I'm not entirely sure if I completely stand by this being the placement in time when this occurred either. Right now, it's just my best guess on the matter. Thank you all for watching and listening to my video about the history of Rot in Elden Ring. I had a really good time researching this video, especially the Battle of Eonia. I found it really fascinating for some reason. I've had this idea for a while of a mini-series where I talk about different battles in fiction, and I think that that would be a really fun one to look at as part of that series, which I have planned. I have a Discord linked in description, as well as some socials, Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit, all of which you're welcome to check out if you so desire. I also have a live stream channel, which I stream on fairly regularly, once or twice a week, and I hope to see you over there as well. Thank you guys for continuing to watch the videos and support this channel. I really like doing this, and I look forward to exploring much more content in the near future. That's gonna do it for today, folks. This is Everberon. Have a good one.